Hello and welcome to the third of these presentations in Introduction to Linguistics, and today we're going to go on to look at another aspect of linguistics. The previous two occasions we've been looking at the sounds that we use in English, particularly how we pronounce, how we produce different sounds, consonants and vowels. And this is the study of the sounds themselves, which is called phonetics. This week, then, we're going to go on to something different, still looking at something which is related to sounds, but as we'll see, it's not exactly sounds that we're studying here, not the sounds themselves anyway, but something a bit more abstract than this. This area of linguistics is called phonology. And this week we're going to be looking at a particular notion in phonology known as the phoneme, and we'll introduce what that is as we go on. Okay, let's first of all start by considering a pair of words in English, pin and bin. Obviously, these are two different words. They mean something different. They both have a meaning, and that meaning isn't the same. So we can see they're obviously different words. Furthermore, they're pronounced differently. Pin, we pronounce it pin, and bin, bin. Now note, these pronunciations are similar in some ways. They both got in at the end of them, but pin begins with a p sound and bin begins with a b sound. Okay, but even those are fairly related sounds because pin and bin are both bilabial plosives. The difference is that with pin you've got the aspirated version, and with bin you've got a voiced bilabial plosive. So the pronunciations of these words is similar to each other, but clearly they must be seen as being different because, after all, these are different words. If they were somehow same sounds, then we wouldn't be able to distinguish words in terms of them. So p and b are clearly different sounds. So what we've got here then is two words which differ from each other in terms of just one sound. Okay, that sound is p and b. We call such words minimal pairs. A minimal pair is basically a pair of words where they differ in terms of one sound. Now that sound doesn't have to be at the beginning of the word as it is with pin and bin, but take pin and pit, for example. There, these two words begin with the same sounds, p, but then end in a different sound, n and t. Okay, and again, these two sounds must be seen as being different sounds because pin and pit are two different words, and if the two sounds were the same sound, then we wouldn't be able to have two different words. Furthermore, pin and pan, again, two different words, and again, minimal pairs, because here they differ not in the beginning or at the end of the word, but in the middle of the word. In pin, you've got the I sound, and pan, you've got the a sound. Okay. So all of these count as minimal pairs, and from the observation of minimal pairs, we can determine what are different sounds in a language. Okay, so p, b, n, t, I, and a are all clearly different sounds because they make minimal pairs when we use them interchangeably. Okay. Different sounds in a language, we call those phones. Okay, now there's something that we need to say about minimal pairs, however, because it's not quite as straightforward as it may seem at the moment. So we've seen here that p and b are two different sounds because they appear in these minimal pairs, pin and bin. Now suppose we took another word, rip. Okay, now we know in English that's pronounced rip, that is with a r at the beginning of it, which is a alveolar approximant. But what happens if we hear somebody pronouncing it as this, with a r in it? That is the alveolar trill, pronouncing it rip. Okay. Now, would an English speaker recognise that as a different word? Chances are that an English speaker would say, no, that's the same word, that's rip, only being pronounced with an accent, a foreign accent, because English speakers don't tend to use a r sound. Okay, so this would be a foreigner trying to pronounce the English word rip, but somehow their own language is interfering with that pronunciation. So they're pronouncing it with an accent. But it's the same word. Okay, so you've got two different pronunciations of the same word, and therefore these two sounds must be seen as being the same sound to some extent. What an English speaker might think of is that r is the kind of a foreign equivalent of a foreign version of the sound r. So what we have then is here we've got two different versions of the same sound, the same phone, which differ across different languages. Now, you might think, well, that's kind of okay, because after all, we've got these two different sounds in two different languages, and to some extent, you might think of them as being equivalent to each other. But that's because you don't get r in English, and you don't get r in a language like Hungarian. So maybe they are somehow related to each other, just different ways of pronouncing them. But we can go even further than that and consider this word here, spin. Okay. Now, in English, this is pronounced not with the same aspirated p as we get in pin, but this time it's pronounced with an unaspirated or just a simple voiceless p. Okay, spin. It's not spin. But if an English person were to hear somebody pronounce this word as spin, would they see that as being a different word? Well, again, just like the rip was seen as a funny pronunciation of the word rip, well, I think an English person, English-speaking person, would take spin as being a funny pronunciation of spin. Okay, it's somebody trying to pronounce spin but doing it wrong somehow or other. So again, p and p, the aspirated and the non-aspirated versions, must be seen as being somehow the same sound, different versions of the same sound. But note, in this case, you can't say that one of them is a foreign pronunciation of this sound, because both of these sounds exist in the English language. You get p in pin, and you get b in spin. Okay? So what we seem to have here then is different versions of the same sound within the same language. Now that calls for an explanation. How can speakers consider two different sounds? I mean, they are different. They're pronounced differently. In fact, they're not pronounced any less differently than, say, p and b are pronounced differently, where one of those is the aspirated and the other one is the voiced version of it. Why are they seen as being completely different sounds, producing different words when we put them into the same position in the word, whereas b and p are seen as being the same type of sound? Okay, so clearly something's going on here, and that needs to be explained. Now, on the way to an explanation to this, we're going to have to introduce a bit of terminology and a bit of way in which we can represent certain things. Take these symbols here. What do they mean? What we've got here is a representation of the places within a word where we can actually find a sound. The hash symbol there represents the word boundaries. Okay, so the the beginnings and the ends of words. So that first set of symbols, where we've got the hash followed by 3 dashes followed by 3 dots, says that the 3 dashes part, that's the sound that we're interested in. That's the place where the sound appears, and the dots are everything else in the word. Okay, so what this is representing is the beginning of the word. Okay, the hash is at the boundary of the word. Then we've got the sound that we're interested in right at the beginning, followed by everything else. The second set of symbols then represent the end of the word, a sound produced at the end of the word. We've got everything else in the word in front of it, then the dash 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 representing the sound that we're interested in, followed by the boundary of the word. The third one represents something that is pronounced in the middle of the word. Okay, we've got some material at the beginning, some material after it, and then the sound that we're interested in surrounded by that. It's in the middle of the word. So we can refer to this first, the top one, as the word initial position. Okay, and the second one is the word final position, and the third one is the word medial position. Now, we're looking therefore at the places in words where you can find certain sounds. Now, if we take a sound like d, for example, you can see that we find d in all of these different positions. We can find it in word initial position, as in din. We can find it in word final position, as in side. Now, don't get confused there by the spelling. The word side ends with a d. It doesn't end with an e. Okay, nobody pronounces this side. So in terms of the pronunciation, d is in the word final position. And then we can have it in word medial position, as in a word like redeem. Okay, so the sound d has a varied distribution, but that's not true of all sounds in a language. Take, for example, the sound w in English. We can get it in word initial position, as in weep, and you can get it in word medial position, as in awake. But there is no English word where we find w in a word final position. You just don't find w at the ends of words. Contrast that with the sound ng, the velar nasal ng. Okay, we can find that word finally, as in sing, and we can find it word medially, as in singer. But you never find an English word where it comes at the beginning of the word. You never have a word initial ng sound. So different sounds have different distributions then. We call the distribution is the set of places where we can find a particular sound, where we can find a phone. Okay, so different phones have different distributions to each other. Now, having said that, there is a set of different distributions that we can find for sounds, which are not just different, but they are actually related to each other. In order to see that, let's have a look at some sounds. In particular, we'll look at the voiceless versus the aspirated p. Okay, so let's start with the aspirated p. We can find that in word initial position, as in peas, pest, past, post, and poison. Okay. Note all of these words differ in terms of the vowel that follows the p, and we still get an aspirated p there. It doesn't matter. We can just find that in initial position. We can also find it in word medial position, as in appease, or repent, or repast, or oppose, or appoint. And again, we see the p here is followed by different vowels and is preceded by different vowels. Okay. One place you can't find it, however, is at the end of a word. You can't say heap, or step, or wrap, or hope, or wipe. Okay, you don't get this aspirated p at the ends of a word. But you might find that's a bit odd, because after all, these words are spelled with a p at the end of them, even though they're not pronounced. What we actually do find here is what is known as the unreleased bilabial plosive. The way we pronounce these words is heap and step and wrap and hope and wipe. Okay, so you don't actually release the p at the end of the word. You bring the lips together to form the closure, but don't release it. So it's a different sound. This isn't the aspirated one, which has got this puff of air following the release. This is a sound where there's no release at all, a different sound. And yet, this is one of these cases where people, English speakers, would see this as being the same thing. The p and the unreleased hip heap type sound. They would say, well, no, it's two versions of the same sound. Okay, but note, where you can get the unreleased one, you can't get the aspirated one. And moreover, where you can get the aspirated one, obviously you can't get the unreleased version. So although these two sounds have different distributions, the different distributions are actually related to each other. Furthermore, there's another sound which is also seems to be related to these two, and that is the one where you get the unvoiced sound without the aspiration. Again, there are places where you can't find this aspirated p, as in, for example, spy is not a good pronunciation, or pray, again, not correct pronunciation, or plead. Okay. Instead, what we have here is this unaspirated, voiceless p. Spy, pray, and plead. Okay, no aspiration there. And again, we can see we've got this kind of related distributions where you can have the aspirated one, you can't have the voiceless one, and where you can have the voiceless one, you can't have the aspirated one. In fact, the distribution of these two sounds is more complex than what we've said so far. Remember, we can have this aspirated p word medially, so we can have appease, repent, etc. However, there are places where you can't have a p, aspirated p, in a word medial position. Take, for example, reaper isn't pronounced reaper, or stepping, or rapper, or hoping, or paper. Okay, that with paper, yes, you do have the aspirated p in the first instance, but that second p is not aspirated. Instead, again, you have the unaspirated voiceless p, as in reaper, and stepping, and paper, rapper, and hoping, and paper. Okay, so we don't have the aspirated one there in these word medial positions. What's the difference? What's going on? When can you say the aspirated version, and when do you get the other version? Okay, well, if you look at it, it's got something to do with the vowels that follow. Okay, look at the aspirated cases like appease, repent, repast, oppose, and appoint. Okay, the vowels that are following that are all they're all stressed vowels. Note, in front of it, we've got the unstressed vowels. We've got the schwa in appease and oppose and appoint, and also the unstressed I in repent and repast. Okay, I and schwa are very typical unstressed vowels. Whereas if you look at the second lot of words like reaper, stepping, rapper, hoping, and paper, there you've got the p followed by the unstressed vowel, and it's preceded by the stressed vowel. So reaper you've got the stress on the re, and then you've got the schwa, p. Okay. So what it seems then is that the way these sounds distribute is that whenever you've got a stressed vowel following it, you pronounce the aspirated version, and whenever you've got an unstressed vowel following it, you pronounce the unvoiced, non-aspirated version. Looking at the top set of examples again, you can see whenever you've got a s in front of it, you pronounced the unvoiced version. Whenever you've got something following it, which isn't a vowel but a consonant like r or l, then again you have the unaspirated, unvoiced version of it. Now, what we see here then is these distributions of these sounds are related to each other. You can get some in some places and others in other places, but they never cross over. You can't ever get them in the same place. So wherever you can get one, you can't get the other, and vice versa. Okay, so where you can pronounce a p, you can't pronounce a b, and wherever you can pronounce a b, you can't pronounce the p. That kind of distributional pattern is known as complementary distribution. And complementary distribution is what tells us that these sounds are actually related to each other. They are, in fact, different versions of the same sound. Okay? Unlike p and b, for example, which are clearly different sounds, as we've seen before, because they form minimal pairs, different words which differ only in terms of those sounds and those sounds alone. Okay, what we see here is not minimal pairs at all. We couldn't get a minimal pair using p and b. Okay, you just couldn't find a minimal pair because you can only find those two sounds in two completely different positions. So minimal pairs tell us which phones are somehow different from each other, and complementary distribution tells us which phones are related to each other, are somehow different versions of the same sound. How can we understand this? Well, this is where phonology comes in. Okay, we can see that these sounds, p, the aspirated one, b, the unaspirated one, and this unreleased p, as in stop. Okay, these sounds, these are all in complementary distribution with each other. You only ever find the unreleased version at the ends of a word. You only ever find the aspirated one before a stressed vowel, and you only ever find the unvoiced one in front of unstressed vowels or in front of a consonant. Okay, another easy way of saying that is, well, everywhere else where you don't find the other two. Okay, so if you only get the unreleased one at the ends of words and the aspirated one in front of a stressed vowel, well, in all other possible positions, that's where you're going to find the other, the unvoiced, the unaspirated p. Okay. So clearly these are related to each other. Now, the way to see this, what this relationship is about, is, as we know, language is knowledge. And one of the things that we must know about then is sounds. We've got to know what sounds are part of our language, and also we've got to know things that tell us how those sounds distribute, what kinds of places in words we can put those sounds, what kinds of sounds are in complementary distribution. This is knowledge, our knowledge of the sound system. So in our head, then, we have some conception of this sound p, but obviously that isn't a sound. What's in our head is not a sound. Sounds are some things that comes out of your mouth. Okay, so this is an internal representation of a sound, and that we call a phoneme. A phoneme is a unit of the system of sounds that we know about, that you can constitute our knowledge. So we've got phonemes in our heads. Phonemes are not sounds. Phones are sounds. Phonemes themselves are not pronunciations of anything. They're not sound waves caused by certain articulatory movements. They are just pieces of knowledge. Okay, they are what is we call the units of the sound system. So the system that makes up a language in terms of its sounds, the units of those are the phonemes, what we know about. Okay, so how does this work? Well, we've got our phoneme in our head, okay, and we want to produce it, we want to pronounce it. In order to know how to pronounce it, which phone to use to realize this, then we have to refer to the rules of the language, which is also, again, part of our knowledge. The rules will tell us how we're going to produce this phoneme in terms of an actual pronunciation. And this is the kind of rule that we have that it basically says exactly what we've just said earlier. Note, the phoneme we represent inside slash brackets. Okay, so that first symbol of this rule says the phoneme p. Okay, followed by an arrow. The arrow means is realized as. So the underlying phoneme p is realized as, and now we've got something in square brackets. And remember, things in square brackets are pronunciations. These are phones. Okay, so we say then the phoneme p is realized as the unreleased p. Okay, that's the p with that little angled bracket next to it, which means the unreleased version. Then there's a big slash. That big slash means in the context of. So we're going to pronounce this phoneme by this phone in this context. And the context, as you can see, is at the end of the word, in front of the word boundary. Okay? And then the second condition, saying that this underlying phoneme gets pronounced as the phone p, the aspirated version, in the context of, and then the context says that the sound is in front of a stressed vowel. The little line in front of the V stands for stress, and the V stands for vowels. Okay, so you pronounce the phoneme p as p, the aspirated phone, when it comes in front of of a stressed vowel. And then the final condition of this rule says it gets pronounced as the unvoiced p everywhere else. Okay, elsewhere. This is known as the elsewhere condition. Typically, phonological rules have this elsewhere condition where we just say everywhere else that hasn't been covered so far, it gets pronounced like this. Okay, so knowing that rule, then we want to pronounce our phoneme. We look at what the context it's going to be pronounced in a particular word, and that will tell us how we're going to pronounce it. So if the sound is at the end of the word, we'll pronounce it as the unreleased version. If it's in front of a stressed vowel, we'll pronounce it as the aspirated version. And if it's anywhere else, we're going to pronounce it as the unvoiced version. Okay. Let's quickly then summarize what we've said so far. Phonemes, we've said, these are the units of the sound system. They get realized as phones, but they are not themselves phones. They are more abstract things. They are basically pieces of knowledge, but they become vocalized by actually articulating them. And when they get articulated, they come out as phones. Now, obviously, there can be more than one phone related to any phoneme. Okay, so there isn't a simple one-to-one relationship for every phone. For every phoneme, there's a phone that realizes it. No, it's more complicated than that. There can be a number of phones associated with a single phoneme. And then which of the phones gets realized? Which of the phones realizes the phoneme and where, in what positions? Well, we have rules that determine that. So there are phonological rules that tell us how to realize these phonemes as phones. Minimal pairs. are words which differ in one phone in one position. Okay, and they clearly tell us which phones are not related to the same phoneme, because if they were related to the same phoneme, there would be a rule that tells you you produce it like this in this position, and therefore in the same position you couldn't produce it as something else. So every time you got a sound, a phone, in the same position as another sound and producing a perfectly good word, we know those two phones are not related to the same phoneme. On the other hand, complementary distribution is the case where we've got a situation where two phones cannot appear in the same position, where you can get one, you can't get the other, and vice versa. And then that tells us that those two phones are related to the same phoneme. So by looking at minimal pairs and looking at complementary distribution patterns, we can work out which phones, which actual sounds we use in any particular language, are related to which phonemes. Okay, and we can therefore determine what the phonemes of the language are by looking at such observations. Now, when you get two phones related to the same phoneme, we call those things allophones. Okay, so p and b and the unreleased p that you get in stop. Okay, these are all allophones of the phoneme p. Okay. All right, well, that's as much as we need to do today. I'll see you in class. Bye-bye.